and we will get ourselves underway. So today we are delighted to be hearing from Dr. Christine Kooi. She is the Louis C. and Katheryn J. Price Professor of European History at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where she has taught since 1994. She obtained her PhD from Yale University under the supervision of Lee Wandel. She is the recipient of our 2020 Friends of the Meter Center Fellowship, which of course was not held in 2020 but deferred to 2021 because of the COVID pandemic. We have been delighted to host Christine here, to welcome her to the center and its collections. And today she will be speaking to us about the project that she is completing, namely her monograph on the Dutch Reformation, to be published by Cambridge University Press. So she will now introduce us to the main themes of her book, which is titled Reformation in the Low Countries, 1500 to 1600. Christine, it's all yours.
Thank you, Karine, and thank you also to Deborah Snyder and Paul Fields, the curator of the Meter Center, for hosting me this evening, or this afternoon, I should say. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate you expressing your interest in my project. As Karine said, this is a book that's been several years in the making, entitled Reformation in the Low Countries, 1500 to 1620. And this book is an attempt to fill a hole in the historiography, the writing about the Reformation in the Low Countries. There is no good, lengthy synthesis of the subject. That is to say, in the past, say, 50, 60 years, historians of the Reformation in the Low Countries have primarily confined themselves to local studies of regions or cities or particular aspects. And well, frankly, for years I've been saying someone needs to write a good overview of the subject after 50 years of this incredibly rich localized research we've had. And so I kind of elected myself to do it. And I'm making an attempt to, as I said, fill a lacuna in the literature on the subject. So hence this book, which, as Katheryn said, will, if all goes well, be published by Cambridge Press and hopefully appear next year in 2022. So, Reformation in the Low Countries. Well, the image I'm posting here, and I always think every Zoom talk is better with images. The image I'm posting here is from a pamphlet that was published in 1567, and the title that it's been given is The Burial of the Mass. And as you can see, there are two individuals here in the center carrying a coffin. These two men are beggar soldiers. That is, they are rebel soldiers against the regime of Philip II, the King of Spain. And these two rebel soldiers, they're not only political rebels, but the pamphlet implies they're also religious rebels, because what are they burying? The Mass inside here. They're burying the elements of the Mass. Here the grave awaits, where the hole is being dug, and as you can see, trailing the coffin is a bunch of weeping monks and nuns. All right, so we have a very nice anti-Catholic pamphlet, shall we say, a very pro-Protestant pamphlet, or image rather, that combines both the political and the religious aspects of the rebellion, the revolt in the Netherlands. And
Christine?
Yes.
Christine, I think we're having an issue with the sound. I've got people report that they're hearing it intermittently. Can I bring you my headphones and we'll try and see if that works
that's
better?
Fine.
Hang on.
Yeah, that's fine. In any case, the caption underneath here describes what the two men are saying. We're carrying to the grave with diligence the blasphemous invention of the Pope, that is the Mass. So the sacrament of the Mass, the central Catholic sacrament, is being vilified here as an invention. Hang on.
Can everyone hear me?
Let's look at the chat.
Yeah, where are you, Chet? I might have to stop sharing the screen.
All right, I'll go back on my end.
All right. Is that better? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, let me try again. All right, so actually I'm hoping this image is from the Royal Library in Brussels, and I'm hoping that Cambridge will see fit to use this as the cover art for the book. That still is to be negotiated. In any case, well, not to get all political on you, but I wanted to show you these two images because one of the things I like to do when I teach is to strive for relevance. And I came across an article this spring that described the Bible that the newest US president, Joseph Biden, swore his oath of office on back in January. And that was a Reims Douay Bible, or a Douay Reims Bible, it's sometimes called. This is a English Catholic Bible that was first produced in the Low Countries at the beginning of the 17th century. It was produced and translated and printed in Douay, which, if you did not know, Douay is now part of France, but back in the 16th century, Douay was part of the Habsburg Low Countries. And in Douay, English Catholic exiles produced an English translation of the Bible, of the Catholic Bible, and it's been known ever since as the Douay Reims. And this Bible, this particular copy of the Douay Reims, has apparently been in the Biden family for over a century. So it's a Netherlandish Bible, one could say, in the sense that it was produced at least partially in Catholic safe havens in the Low Countries in the end of the 16th century. And that got me curious about other presidential Bibles. And it turns out that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, back when he was sworn in as president in 1932, swore his oath on a Staten Bible, that is the official Dutch or Protestant translation of the Christian Bible that was first commissioned by the Synod of Dordrecht in 1619 and completed in 1637, and became a rather definitive translation of the Protestant Bible version of the Bible into Dutch. So I only put these up here to kind of remind you that the tentacles, if you will, of the Reformation in the Low Countries are actually fairly deep and fairly long, and we can find echoes of it in a variety of, well, sometimes unexpected places. In any case, this book is about the Reformation in the Low Countries, and I need to provide you with a bit of definition. When I say Low Countries in this book, I mean the whole of the Low Countries, what now would comprise the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Belgium, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and, well, little northern bits of the French Republic. In the 16th century, the Low Countries, this whole region, by the middle of the 16th century, was under the control of the Habsburg Dynasty. And in particular, let me go ahead here to, it was under the control, or at least under the sovereignty of Charles V, the King of Spain, and also the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles had done a lot to integrate or at least assemble this collection of territories under his sovereignty. He had inherited a bunch of them through his mother or excuse me, through his grandmother, and then became sovereign of the Low Countries in 1509. And one thing that I try to point out in the book is that when we understand the 16th century Low Countries, we have to understand them this way. There's not a Belgium or Netherlands in existence yet. When we're better off thinking of the context of the Reformation in the Low Countries in terms of this collection of territories. It's a composite state assembled by the Habsburgs and their predecessors, the Dukes of Burgundy, over about a 200-year period. And as you can see from the map, by mid-century, it comprises these 17 regions. And also the smaller map next to it, I just wanted to show you the boundaries of the Catholic diocese of the Low Countries before 1559. All right, there were what, 6 or 7 different bishoprics that the Low Countries was divided into. The reason why I want to do the whole of the Low Countries is because there's been a long tradition in the historiography of the Reformation Low Countries of either writing just about the North or just about the South. That is the ancestral state of what becomes the Kingdom of the Netherlands, or the ancestral state of what becomes the Kingdom of Belgium. Whereas I think it's less anachronistic and much more fruitful to think of it in terms of how it was understood in the 16th century as a composite whole. Now, all of these different territories were run, by their own local either nobility or civic magistracies. There was a strong tradition of particularism in the Low Countries, of people ruling their own affairs. And the Habsburgs coming in, or the Dukes of Burgundy and the Habsburgs coming in to try and create a more centralized government, was a relatively new phenomenon. The political traditions of the Low Countries were very much about local sovereignty. So part of the political backdrop of the Reformation in the Low Countries is the fact that there is a dynasty, the Habsburg dynasty, personified in the 16th century, at first by Charles V, a dynasty intent on increasing its power, its ability to extract revenue from this region, and a contest is starting to develop between the central powers, the Habsburg dynasty, and the local powers that have always traditionally ruled this region. So the political backdrop, and my book is very much about how the political backdrop explains in some ways the Reformation in the Low Countries. The political backdrop is what Hugo de Schepper once referred to as the integration and disintegration of the Habsburg Netherlandish state. That is, through the trajectory of the 16th century, was that the Low Countries became, if not quite unified, at least assembled under one sovereignty, that of the Habsburg dynasty, and that the subsequent wars in the second half of the 16th century showed the disintegration of that Habsburg state. So this Habsburg composite state in the Netherlands was actually a fairly short duration. And it's partly because the Reformation causes disruptions in Habsburg central power and in its ability to aggrandize its own central authority. So we're better off understanding the Low Countries as this big whole, as a political whole. Not that it was terribly unified, or in fact is quite diverse linguistically and culturally and economically. In fact, there are historians who argue that a better way to understand a division in the Low Countries in the 16th century is between the maritime urban West and the more agrarian rural East. And we see that pattern in the Reformation history of the Low Countries. Much more of the religious agitation takes place along the seaside regions of the Low Countries than in the interior. Well, one of the myths that has, I think, long been dispelled about the Europe before the Reformation was the notion that the Catholic Church was a corrupt, decaying, unpopular institution. And many scholars have pointed out that late medieval piety, that is, religious life in Europe, including the Netherlands, on the eve of the protests of the Reformation, the late 15th century, the beginning of the 16th century, that religious life was in fact quite vibrant. And that was true for the Low Countries as well. That there was enormous popular enthusiasm for the rituals of the church, the mechanisms of the church. That is, people participated. For example, on the right here, I have a picture of the tower of the St. Rumbold Church in Mechelen, Malines in Brabant, which was built entirely by indulgence selling in the 1520s. Right, people buying indulgences, which went to the construction of this very impressive four-square tower. And I have an image here of a print of what was called the Seven Sorrows of the Virgin Mary. This was a very popular cult, that devotional cult that developed in the late 14th century in the Low Countries, in which penitents and pilgrims could meditate on the seven sorrows of the Virgin. That is, the Virgin Mary experiencing the passion of Christ, the seven sorrows that made up the passion of Christ, his suffering and his crucifixion and his death. And so Marian devotion is very popular. Devotion to saints, people are going on pilgrimage. Miri Rubin has talked about how the celebration of Corpus Christi, which was a very popular late medieval devotion, had its start in Liège, right, which was part of the Low Countries, technically under a separate bishopric, but very much in its sphere of influence. So my point is, and one of the points I set out in setting up this context, is that, like everywhere else in Europe, the devotion to the Catholic Church is vibrant. And it's precisely because there is such devotion that there are voices that say, well, perhaps the church could do better. Right. In other words, people are invested in the Catholic Church in the beginning of the 16th century. The Reformation, I always tell students, it doesn't arise out of indifference. It arises because people are invested. They are stakeholders in the success of the Catholic Church. And so, and as I'm sure many of you know, already by the early 16th century, there are voices among scholars, among theologians, among churchmen, saying perhaps reformatio, that is a renewal, is in order. That is, that the church has become in some ways unwieldy, unworldly, that it may have strayed from some of its original values and teachings. Alternatively, people like Erasmus, the great humanist, are arguing that the church is allowing too much superstition. Right, and I suspect Erasmus would include the cult of the seven sorrows of the Virgin Mary in that rubric. So there are voices already out there, and they've been out there for centuries, calling for reform in the church. Now, as we all know, in 1517, of course, Martin Luther has makes his protest against the church, and within a couple of years, it gets well out of hand from the point of view of the church, and becomes an entirely different movement. Luther's ideas are already circulating in print in the Low Countries in 1518, and they get translated into Dutch by 1520, and not just Luther's writings, but also those later of Zwingli by 1521. And so these ideas, which later generations will term Protestant or identify as Protestant, those ideas, those pamphlets, those books are following the trade routes along the Rhine and through northern France that crisscross the Low Countries. This is a very commercial world. Antwerp is the biggest city in the Low Countries. It is an emporium for all sorts of goods and commodities, but also for ideas. And Antwerp is a big printing center, and it's does not take long after the initial stirrings of controversy in the empire, in the Holy Roman Empire, for those ideas to make their way into the Low Countries. And those ideas are circulated among all sorts of literate classes, among urban folk, among clergy, among scholars and teachers. some of Luther's ideas and Zwingli's ideas, some of these ideas have resonance. So much so that by the early 1520s already, the Habsburg authorities are getting nervous because there seems to be a movement of dissent, or at least of people too uncomfortably interested in reforming ideas. And the Habsburg government, Charles V in particular, reacts against the spread of these ideas fairly quickly. Now, Charles, you remember, he's sovereign of the Low Countries as Duke of Burgundy. He's also Holy Roman Emperor. But in the Holy Roman Empire, Charles's hands are tied as to how he can deal with heresy. He's got all those prickly imperial princes and cities to deal with. As sovereign over the Low Countries, these are Charles's patrimonial lands, and he has a freer hand legally to try and take steps against heresy. And so already in 1522, Charles starts issuing laws that will create a judicial apparatus that will try to suppress ideas that were deemed by the majority of right-thinking people as dangerous, right, as dangerous to good order. And in 1523, in fact, on the Grand Place of the city of Brussels, two Augustinian monks, Hendrik Vos and Johannes van den Essen, are burned to death at the stake for espousing what were termed Lutheran ideas. And Martin Luther, in fact, got wind of this execution and almost immediately claimed Vos and van den Essen for his cause. And so in retrospect, these two men became the first martyrs, the first people killed for what were recognizably Protestant ideals. And this happens already in July of 1523. The interesting thing about this is it's a nice symbolic moment because it also exemplifies just how harsh the reaction to Protestant dissent, heresy, will be in the Low Countries. William Monter has done a study that shows that the by far the greatest number of people killed, judicially executed for espousing heretical, that is, Protestant ideas, the greatest number were actually in the Low Countries. And that was in part because of the judicial regime that the Habsburgs set up. This regime was often referred to as the Inquisition by the people it targeted, and by later Dutch Protestant propaganda. It wasn't technically an inquisition so much as a very complicated, multi-layered, multifaceted judicial effort that was directed by the state, but also incorporated the church in its efforts to suppress, again, what were seen as very dangerous ideas. So one peculiarity about the Reformation in the Low Countries that I make in the book, one that I note, is that the very heavy judicial backlash that it inspired, and something like 3,000 people altogether in the course of the 16th century were executed for heresy in the Low Countries, which is far greater by several orders of magnitude than nearly anywhere else in Europe. Now, the question becomes, of course, what do these people believe? Well, there's a kind of biblicism. There is this notion of sola scriptura, popularized as sola scriptura. There is a desire to see the introduction of biblical norms into church life and into moral life. There is a questioning of the sacrament of the Mass, like I showed you in the beginning of the slide, that is, whether the Christ was actually physically present as the Catholic Church taught, or whether in fact this was so much mummery, or whether there was a sort of symbolic presence of Christ in the Mass. And the sacramentarianism of these early evangelicals in the Low Countries, it's quite prevalent. They have a lot of questions about whether God is in that bread, shall we say, or in that wine. So that's part of it. Now, that's in the 1520s, and these are people, most of them, the vast majority of them, have no interest in creating a new church. They just have questions. They are serious Christians. They are interested in trying to figure out how reformatio, this notion of both internal and institutional reform, how that can be worked out. But they're not interested in being heretics, and most of them seem to have reconciled them back to the church, especially when the judicial backlash became more stringent. In the 1530s, however, things start to twist a little or ramp up a bit. And what we see is the emergence by 1530 already of an Anabaptist movement that is of a more radical, if you will, branch of religious protest. Now, I understand from my colleagues in Anabaptist history that they're starting to eschew the term radical, because all Protestants were radical in the Reformation, and that point is certainly well taken. I think what's radical for this context, the Netherlands in the 1530s, is how much these Anabaptists wanted to overturn not just the church order, but the social order as well. The kind of Anabaptism that became most prevalent in the Low Countries was known as Melchiorite Anabaptism, named after Melchior Hoffman, the Swabian furrier who became an Anabaptist prophet, mostly working in North Germany, and then he settled in Strasbourg later. And his brand of Anabaptism, which, and this was a belief in a very literal biblicism, that is sola scriptura, leading to a kind of very intentional concentration on how not just religious life should be organized along biblical norms, but how social life and even political life should be ordered that way. And this, I think, is what makes the Anabaptists radical. I mean, what's most famous about them is, the sort of umbrella characteristic is that they believe in adult baptism, in believers' baptism, rather than, and kind of overthrew centuries of tradition of children's baptism. In the 1530s, the Melchiorite Anabaptists were convinced the end of the world was coming, and they weren't alone in this necessarily, but they famously take over the city of Münster in northwest Germany in 1534 and 35. And a lot of those Melchiorite Anabaptists were from the Netherlands, from the Low Countries. In fact, at the same time that the Melchiorites are taking over the city of Münster, they are also trying to stir up trouble in the city of Amsterdam. And there's the famous Nachtloperij, that is this famous running naked in the streets by quite a few Anabaptists in Amsterdam in 1535, where these were people who, in a kind of religious ecstasy, took off their clothes, threw them in a fire, denounced every material thing, and ran naked through the streets of Amsterdam. And then more seriously, another group of Anabaptists tried to take over the city government of Amsterdam. So it was clear, at least in the minds of authorities, that the Anabaptists were intent on revolution. And so when Münster finally falls in the summer of 1535, there is a tremendous judicial backlash against anyone who was seen as an Anabaptist or any sort of heretic in the Low Countries. And I have a nice image here probably from around 1540 of Amsterdam, of two Anabaptists being hung for their beliefs in Amsterdam. And again, a lot of the judicial backlash that I talked about, that heavy judicial persecution of Protestants, fell predominantly heavily on the Anabaptist movement, and it almost looked like the Inquisition, if you will, succeeded in that. By, say, the early 1540s, things get a little quieter. The Anabaptists, well, either they scatter, they reconcile. Some of them end up joining more quietist, pacifistic movements like the Mennonites and what are broadly known as the Doopgezinde movements in the Low Countries. By the time we get to the mid-century, like the Habsburg Habsburgs have achieved their effort to establish their sovereignty over the whole of the Low Countries, this region tucked between the Empire and France. In the mid-century, Charles V abdicates, hands over power to his son Philip II, who is the King of Spain. And Philip is intent on continuing the policies of his father. Philip also believes that heresy is something that needs to be combated, that it's a mortal threat to the good order of society. It's sort of the terrorism of the 16th century, as I like to tell students, which kind of shocks them, but that's how in some ways it was seen. So the Habsburgs have been trying to build up their power. The Inquisition, or the repression of heresy, the anti-heresy laws that they create, are also part of that effort to increase central power. And as a consequence, the judicial regime, although it's fairly effective, at least until the early 1550s, it also causes a great deal of local resentment. The anti-heresy legislation flew in the face of a lot of local rights and local privileges and traditions, particularly the right of people to be tried in their own hometowns. There was confiscations of goods. So even though, at least until the 1550s, this regime was effective, it was very controversial. And it kind of added to the grievances that local nobles and local city governments had about what they saw as a kind of heavy-handedness when it came to religious policy. And in the 1560s, that unease with Habsburg power or Habsburg policy will break out into open rebellion. Now, something else is happening at mid-century that I talk about in the book, and that is the Reformation, if you will. And when I say Reformation, I should say I mean all religious change, right? This is not a purely Protestant story, but Reformation in the Low Countries takes what I call a confessional turn. By the 1560s, certainly, we can see sort of three streams, if you will, three very broad streams of reform that are coalescing or taking shape in the Low Countries. One is, of course, the Anabaptists, who certainly by the 1560s have, or at least some of them have morphed into Mennonite or baptism-minded Doopsgezinde groups that are more interested, that have rejected the idea of revolution and have instead concentrated on internal reform and an interior piety. And Menno Simons, who is their great prophet and theologian, develops a kind of theology that eschews the idea of political or social revolution, and instead argues that Christians should segregate themselves from the world, should not take oaths, should concentrate on their own interior improvement. So we have Mennonitism and Doopsgezinde groups as sort of one stream, and I'm simplifying greatly here because within these streams are lots of variations and complications. There's also an ongoing effort that's been going on actually since the early 16th century at Catholic Reformation, and the reform of the church, that is institutional reform, the reorganization of the bishoprics of the Low Countries, the creation the introduction, I should say, of the ideas, the dictates, the canons of the Council of Trent. In other words, there's an ongoing story of Catholic Reformation that is a subtext to this as well. And we can see, certainly by mid-century, that Catholic reform is also a stream within the Low Countries. It's the Habsburgs who, in fact, encourage Catholic Reformation quite a bit. They're the ones who forced the reorganization of the bishoprics of the Low Countries in 1559. And in these new bishoprics, the new bishops are supposed to do good things like superintend their priests more. They are supposed to take care of heresy. They're supposed to create seminaries for their priests. In other words, Catholic Reformation is this ongoing thing. And then finally, there's a third stream, and that's the Reformed. That is what is popularly but not very accurately known as Calvinism. And I say that with all due apologies to the Meter Center of Calvin Studies, that the Reformed Protestantism, ideas that first arose with Zwingli, later with Calvin, in the Swiss cities, certainly by 1560, Reformed Protestantism has become the third stream. Calvin, as you know, Geneva have been sending out missionaries into France, and many of those French missionaries, the Huguenot movement, starts to have its effect on an influence on, certainly in the Francophone Low Countries, Tournai, Valenciennes, these Lille, these southern cities became hotbeds of the Reform movement in the 1560s. Also the far southwest of Flanders, Ypres. And by the time we get to the 1560s, places like Antwerp and Ghent and Bruges, the major cities of Brabant and Flanders, have substantial Reformed congregations. So, and these groups are rather aggressive in terms of what they want. They start staging various sorts of actions. They free people accused of heresy from prison. They stage what were called chanteries, that they went around singing psalms openly in public. All sorts of sort of interesting little kind of symbolic actions took place. And by the time we get to 1565, it's clear that the Reformed Protestants are trouble, at least from the eyes of the Habsburg authorities. They are militant. They have a very clear sense of their organization and of their desires. They are very, very anti-Catholic, and they're fairly brazen. They are supported in part by congregations in England and in Germany, and they are on the march. And which of course means that the anti-heresy legislation will be applied to them that much more fiercely. Well, things come to a head, and in 1566, part of the nobility of the Low Countries, which was the part that was most closely allied with the Reform movement, protests against the Habsburg government. This is the famous compromise of the nobility, where the gentry come in and protest basically the Inquisition. Right? That is, their initial protest is that the Inquisition, and they never talk about heresy, they never talk about Protestant ideas, they just say the Inquisition is ruining the country. Right? So the spark of opposition is lit by religious policy. Right? And this in turn emboldens the Reformed, who start meeting openly in what were called the Hedge Preachings. This is a nice image of that. Here is the city of Antwerp along the River Scheldt. And over here in the corner, you can see a whole bunch of people listening to a preacher out in the countryside. And these Hedge Preachings, as they were called, became very popular, where Reformed ministers preached their ideas. And eventually things get even more ramped up. And in the summer and fall of 1566, we have an outbreak of what was known as the Belden Storm, or the Iconoclastic Fury, that over about an 8-week period saw mobs of Protestants attacking churches. Right? This is a famous Franz Hogenberg depiction after the event, supposed to be the cathedral in Antwerp. And it depicts these mobs pulling down statues, breaking stained glass windows, all while people look on, and the civic militia seems to do nothing. And so this iconoclastic outbreak, in turn, of course, causes still more reaction by the Habsburg government, and famously, as I'm sure you've all heard, Philip II sends the Duke of Alba to set up a military regime. Alba in turn is empowered to set up the Council of Troubles, which is designed to root out and punish sedition and by consequence heresy. Right? So a military regime gets set up. And the opposition, which by this time is led by the nobility and is personified, of course, by William of Orange, the political opposition to the Habsburg government is forced into exile, and so is the religious opposition. And it's in exile that the political rebels, who are mostly either civic magistrates or nobles, and the religious dissidents, mostly the Reformed Protestants, form a rather uneasy alliance with each other against the Habsburg government. And from the point of view of the Habsburg government, this alliance, if you will, the rebel alliance, is deeply troubling, is dangerous. I found this this image here. It's an allegory of the ship of state and church, and it's supposed to depict the Habsburg government of the Low Countries navigating the ship of state through all sorts of treacherous waters, right? The waters full of heresy, and of course, instead it's giants and mermaids and that sort of thing. And if you look at a close-up in the of the image, this is supposed to be Philip II, the King of Spain. This is supposed to be the Duke of Alba. In other words, from the Habsburg point of view, this is a dangerous revolutionary radical movement that is usurping authority. It's seditious in addition to being heretical. And so the fourth chapter of my book talks about the wars. The revolt, what was called the Revolt of the Netherlands, or more traditionally, the 80 Years' War. And my book isn't really so much about that revolt per se, except this chapter talks about how religiously informed that rebellion, those wars were, because sometimes it was a rebellion, sometimes it was civil war, sometimes it was a religious war, a confessional one. And I won't go, bore you with all the details of that war. There are lots of good books about that subject. The upshot is that by the end of the 16th century, the wars, the Revolt of the Netherlands, the 80 Years' War, the wars had created effectively two states. In the north, the rebels led by William of Orange were able to gain territory in Holland, Zeeland, parts of Brabant and Flanders. And they held on to these territories starting in 1572, and eventually were able to fashion a state from these territories. They tried hard to conquer the rest. That didn't work. And the Habsburgs in turn tried hard to reconquer the north for their dynasty, and that didn't work. And so the upshot is that by, say, the 1580s and 1590s, there's this military frontier between an insurgent independent north and a Habsburg south. And of course, if you know your maps at all, you can see that these are incipient versions of what will later become the Netherlands and Belgium. But no one knows that at the time. Another aspect of the Reformation in the Low Countries that I think is significant is that it's the only religious war in Europe, insofar as that revolt was a religious war, but it's the only time where religious war in the 16th century actually changes the political map. That is, it results in the creation of what will become an entirely new state, and that becomes known as the Dutch Republic, or the United Provinces. And the south, the southern Netherlands, or what's sometimes referred to as the Archducal Netherlands, continues to remain under Habsburg control. Right? So that by the 1600s, what we have is the creation of a new state, a different map, a bifurcated Low Countries. And Reformation continues in both of those places but under rather different guises. In the southern Netherlands, or the Archducal Netherlands, what's sometimes rather inaccurately referred to as the Spanish Netherlands, in the southern Netherlands, Catholic Reformation continues, or if anything gets restarted after the upheavals of the wars. And what happens is that the southern Netherlands, or the Archducal Netherlands, and then I call them that because they were ruled by the Archdukes Albert and Isabella, and they're here in this little in this image of a religious procession in Brussels. The Archducal Netherlands very conscientiously embarked on a program of recatholicization. That is, the Habsburg government there tied rebuilding the Catholic Church, reforming the Catholic Church very much to their dynastic authority. And what ends up happening, as I'm sure many of you know, is that there is a massive migration from the southern Netherlands to the north, in some cases, but also into Germany and England, of many, many people. About 150,000 is the best estimate. And that 150,000, most of them were Protestant, not necessarily all. They might have been economic refugees as well as religious ones. But it depopulates the Protestant community in the South. In other words, Protestantism in the Low Countries, its heartlands, its homes were the South, right? Flanders and Brabant. And it's only later in the late 16th century that it migrates north. Now, so the southern Netherlands, the Archducal Netherlands, is very much a Catholic confessional state. It rebuilds churches, it brings in new religious orders like the Society of Jesus. It continues that work of Reformation. So Catholic Reformation, in a sense, continues in the South. The North, however, what becomes the Dutch Republic or the United Provinces, that's another story. Their Reformation is rather more complicated because the relationship in the Dutch Republic between the principal church and the government is well, ambivalent, right? Whereas the archducal government of the South wholeheartedly embraced the Catholic Church and supported a policy of recatholicization. In the Dutch Republic, well, yeah, there is this privileged church. There is one legal church, the Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, but no one is forced to join it. And the political leaders of the Dutch Republic, who are all mostly urban oligarchs, urban patricians, they say no one has to join this church, but yet this church still has to welcome anyone who wants to get married in it, who wants to be baptized in it. So we have a Reformed church, a church set up along Reformed models coming out of France and Geneva, a distinctly Reformed polity, if you will. But that church is actually, although it's privileged, it's the only church that has the right to worship publicly. It's the church that you're supposed to go to on national days of prayer. It's the church that provides the chaplains for the armed forces. It's the privileged church of the Dutch Republic, but it's not a state church because no one is required to join it. And at the same time, the Reformed Church itself insisted that if you wanted to join the church, you actually had to undergo a fairly rigorous examination and submit yourself to discipline. And so the result is that in the Dutch Republic, which is a nominally Protestant or Reformed state, the public church, the only church that's allowed to worship openly, probably comprises at most a plurality rather than a majority of the population, at least in the beginning of the 17th century. And what was everyone else doing? Well, everyone who wasn't Reformed, well, they might go to that church, but they wouldn't become members. They might be Lutherans, because there's a substantial Lutheran community that sets itself up in Amsterdam. They might be Mennonites or doopgezind. They might even still be Catholic. There's a substantial Catholic minority in the Dutch Republic throughout this period. Right? So what you get is a public church and a state that, at least on its facade, is Reformed or Calvinist, but in reality is demographically very, very mixed. It's multi-confessional. And so in some ways, the Reformation that occurs in the Dutch Republic, the continuation of Reformation in the Dutch Republic, is kind of a it's kind of a continuation of that very eclectic Reformation of the early 1520s, where people kind of took things that interested them and ignored the rest. And so you had, and Jo Spans, who's here in the audience, knows well that that there seemed to be a whole lot of people who just didn't go to any kind of church at all, who were unchurched, shall we say. And yet there were all these private beliefs. There, freedom of conscience was the law of the land. So in your heart of hearts, you could be a Catholic or a Mennonite or a Lutheran. You weren't allowed to express that publicly, but even that is kind of a polite fiction, as Ben Kaplan has shown, that there's a kind of sense of, well, as long as people don't make trouble, they can worship in their homes as much as they like. But that, again, that's a very contingent and expedient kind of arrangement. I hesitate to call it an ecclesiastical settlement. It's more like a big ad hoc arrangement where the authorities say, well, if you're a Catholic or you're a Lutheran or you're a Mennonite, you're Jewish. There's a Jewish community, of course, that comes in the 17th century. As long as you are quiet about it, we won't make too much trouble. But it's a toleration, and I mean toleration in the sort of 17th century sense of suffering or allowing. It's a contingent toleration. I borrowed a phrase from the political philosopher Michael Walzer to describe this as a regime of toleration. It's a managed toleration. That is, the government keeps an eye on all of the different religious bodies, and this is primarily local government that's doing this. Local governments keep an eye and manage religious coexistence. And whenever anyone gets out of hand, if there's trouble, and again, this varies greatly from time and place, the authorities might step in and suppress worship, arrest a Catholic priest, for example, or fine a congregation in order to pay a bribe, essentially, to be tolerated. So what we have is, in the southern Netherlands, we have effectively a Catholic confessional state. Right. And in the Dutch Republic, the northern Netherlands, we have, well, yeah, it's a Protestant country, sort of, but it's a regime of toleration. And it's a regime that is very bumpy. It's like I said, it's not neat and tidy and unified in the way that the Catholic South tried to be. And one of the things I suggest in my book is that one could argue that Reformation in the South was much more successful than it was in the North. That is, if you take it on its own terms, the Recatholicization, Catholic Reformation in the Southern Netherlands actually worked quite well. Created a fairly uniformly Catholic state with, small marginalized groups of Protestants. In the North, Reformation is much messier. Right? As much as the Reformed Church would have liked to have seen a further reformation of all of Dutch society, they did not get that. And they were forced to be the public church in a society that was, in fact, quite multi-confessional. Right? And arguably, if taken on their own terms, this Reformation, this Catholic Reformation of the South, in some ways, was much more successful, or at least more enduring, than the very complicated, messy Reformation in the North. So anyway, my intent in writing this book, and I go to 1620 because 1620 is when we have the famous Synod of Dordrecht, where the Reformed Church in the Dutch Republic establishes its orthodoxy once and for all. 1621 is also the year that the Archduke Albert dies in the southern Netherlands. So I had to stop because at a certain point, I felt like this was becoming two narratives instead of one. That is, Reformation in the Low Countries, certainly by 1620, has become two stories. And life is short, and I didn't want to write all that as well. So I chose to end the narrative at 1620. And My goal in doing this was I've had a lot of colleagues in early modern European history ask me for a reference for a good overview of it. And it's been a real hole in the literature that there hasn't been. So this is my attempt. I wrote it particularly with non-specialists in mind, and I've tried to encapsulate and put together what's the work of hundreds of scholars, right? Some of whom I have known personally, others of whom were giants in the field, but it's an attempt at synthesis. Right? And in particular, my focus is on how the politics of the Low Countries in the 16th century affect religious change, and vice versa. That is how politics in turn are driven and influenced by Reformation as well. So thank you for your attention. That is it in a very quick nutshell, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments. So thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was great. Keep the headphones on, I think, because you'll probably need them yet. So what I would say at this point is I just have a couple of questions which I'd like to get to. And my first one really is, what would you describe, if you had to sort of summarize the challenges of writing this particular study? Obviously, writing every book has challenges, but for this particular study, what would you say?
I think the biggest challenge is that this is a very hard part of the world to generalize about. It's the size of Scotland. It's got maybe 3 million people in the 16th century, and it is absurdly diverse. And it's very atomized. And I say in the conclusion of the book, for every generalization I could make about the Low Countries, the Reformation in the Low Countries, I can find 5 exceptions. So part of it, I think for me, the biggest challenge was my awareness that that like all narratives, this is artificial, right? That it's a construction, it's hard to take into account just how diverse, what happens in the Dutch, there's barely any Reformation in the Duchy of Luxembourg except Catholic reform, and yet Friesland is full of Mennonites. And so to take account for that diversity, which is what scholars have been concentrating on in the literature for the last 50 years, just the extreme diversity of experience. But my goal was, well, how do you summarize diversity? How do you encapsulate it? Are there big lines to be seen, to be described? And I'm trying to create a kind of, like I said, a constructive narrative, but this is my attempt. Let's put it that way. But I will say, accounting for locality, particularism, diversity, that was the biggest challenge conceptually.
And I can imagine that's maybe one of the reasons why there haven't been too many one-volume texts written about it, right?
Alistair Duke told me a few years ago he'd tried to do this and he gave up, and I kind of understand why. Because it's a very complicated story. So.
The other question I had as you went along was, did you find themes or topics or areas that you felt were really understudied? In other words, where more research needs to be done as you went along? Were there holes in the research along the way?
The hole that struck me the most is what happens in the Francophone part of the Low Countries, Wallonia, after the 1560s. There's been great work done by Belgian scholars in particular about the Reformation, what the religious change and religious culture in Flanders and Brabant in the 17th century. Great counter-Reformation, Catholic reform stuff, but it's all in the Flemish-speaking parts, and I'm hard-pressed to find anyone who has written extensively about Liège, Namur. There are a couple of, there's 1 or 2 studies of Lille as a center of the counter-Reformation, but that I find that I don't know if it's the Walloon historians are not interested in it, but there's a lot more on the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, its religious history, than on the French. So that to me was the biggest. I thought surely someone would have written more. People would have written more, but maybe it doesn't interest those scholars. I don't know. So.
it's really fascinating what grabs people's interest, right? So we're getting questions now on the chat, so I'm going to work through some of them. The first one is, this is a great and needed overview. Were there also new insights? So new insights.
I hesitate to make that claim. I think what I told someone the other day was, I feel like the framework is what's most novel about this book. That is the presentation of it. Honestly, no one has tried to do a monograph, a summary of this length in many, many years, many decades. And so I'm not sure, I don't necessarily have new insights. What I'm trying to do is summarize and synthesize some of my research, yes, but mostly the work of other scholars. And I'm not sure there's not a new thesis in it necessarily. It's more a presentation of the work of a whole lot of other people.
Yep.
So I will not make any claim of novelty, except that I made the attempt to kind of tie it up in a package. And not everyone's going to be convinced by that package, and boy, I invite you to take a crack at it, because it only took me 10 years. So I think it's more the framework that I'm giving it, that it's like, here is an account, here's a way to understand Reformation in the Low Countries, the totality of the Low Countries, all types of religious change, not just Protestant. And to kind of build up on all the fine work all sorts of early modern scholars have done on 16th and 17th century European history. So
I think seeing these side-by-side experiences, I think, is actually not done by others, and that's where it can be very, very fruitful and very encouraging. So a couple more questions that have come in. So a question from our student, Sam Ha. He says, my question has to do with the Marian exiles. As far as I understand, some of them went to the Low Countries between 53 and 58. Did they have any impact on the Reformation in the Low Countries, or was their influence minimal compared to the one they had in places like Geneva or Frankfurt, possibly because they were such a small group? And is there signs of Protestantism of the Netherlands influencing the Marian exiles at all? Any thoughts?
Oh, okay. Well, the Marian exiles are not in the Low Countries that long. I think they have more influence in Germany, Sam. I think you're right. I mean, and if anything, I think the opposite is true. It seems to me, especially after 1558, when Elizabeth comes in and the Dutch stranger churches are restored, Dutch and French stranger churches are restored, that the influence goes in the opposite direction. That a lot of the 1560s, a lot of the Reformed radicals of the 1560s get a lot of help and support from churches in Sandwich and Norwich, and as well as the Rhenish, the congregations in the Rhineland and the Palatinate as well. So I think if anything, it works the other way. It's more England to the Low Countries, and those Marian exiles aren't there all that long.
So a question from Lyle Birma. Did the Reformed in the Low Countries in the 1560s sense any contradiction between their criticism of the anarchistic behavior of the Anabaptists, for instance, see the Belgian Confession of 1561, and their own iconoclastic behavior in 1566?
Oh yes. There's the Iconoclastic Fury was very controversial. There were Guy de Bray, who was the author of the Belgic Confession, distanced himself from it. A lot of Reformed divines, leaders, denounced it as destructive anarchic behavior. Opinion about that was very mixed, and of course the iconoclasm itself was highly varied. Sometimes it was organized mobs directed by a particular preacher. Sometimes it was spontaneous, but at least initially, after it was kind of over, or while it was happening and after it was over, most responsible Reformed leaders denounced it as violence. But only later, when the Council of Troubles gets set up and there's a military regime, then there are efforts by people like Philip Marnix of St. Aldegond, a Reformed noble, to try and justify the violence after the fact. That is, that the Reformed were so oppressed that they were driven to act out this way. But there was no, at least initially, the Reformed leadership tried to step away from the violence.
So a question from Robert Teagues. Is there anything you found interesting or worthwhile, but just could not find a way to work into the book?
Oh, so much. I wish I could have done more about material culture. I think there's a very and Andrew Spicer, where are you? You're the expert on this. I think there's more to be done on the material culture aspect of it. The reset, the destruction of the iconoclasm, for example, that we just talked about, but also the reconstruction of churches. If I'd had more time, I think I might have tried to devote more attention to how the church landscape, or the religious landscape, in some ways changes the material aspects of religiosity. The people are working on that, and I think there are very interesting things to be said about that.
Question from Catherine French. In what ways was the urban experience of Reformed, Catholic, and Protestant similar because of the organization and priorities of cities versus the countryside?
Oh boy, good question. Well, I will say that it's in cities where you see reform happening most intensely, whether it's Catholic or Protestant. What's interesting is, for example, when after the 1580s, when we're in a period of having effectively two states, you see some of the same echoes of local urban resistance to the church's attempt to impose certain types of norms of behavior, right? So that there are cases of, bishops, the Bishop of Bruges, for example, the Bishop of Ghent, trying to impose fines on people so that they will go to mass regularly and act like good Catholics. And some city governments resist those impositions. They say there's still enough of a Protestant minority in our population that we don't want to ruffle feathers and cause trouble. And you see something similar going on in the Dutch Republic, in the sense that their city governments, who are the real powers of that state, city governments contain reformed efforts at reforming everyone to just reform churches, reform congregations. In other words, they're not going to let the Reformed Church change society as a whole. Instead, ecclesiastical discipline will only be will only pertain to the congregations, right? So that, so there's, and then later in the 17th century, there are debates in the Dutch Republic about Sabbath observance and that sort of thing. And it's clear that the Reformed are constantly stymied by local authorities, local civic authorities, in their efforts to try and Protestantize everything. In the same way, it's local authorities who allow this connivance, this toleration of religious minorities, even though the Reformed would like to see all those religious minorities kind of done away with, shall we say, or controlled more. So yeah, there are similarities. That same kind of urban particularism, you see parallels between the two. So.
A question from Randy Blacketer. How does your methodology or framework differ from the study of Alistair Duke's Reformation and Revolt in the Low Countries, 2003?
Well, Alistair is a fine-grained historian. Let me put it that way. He digs into archives. I think he is a far more adept historian than I am in terms of just mining from archives what we know about that, especially about the early Reformation in the Low Countries. My approach, like I said, has been synthetic. I'm borrowing heavily from Alistair and from a whole bunch of other people whom I have tried to acknowledge in all my many footnotes, that I'm building on that work. And I'm trying, I think Alistair's insights are actually quite good ones, and I rely on them heavily. So I wouldn't say necessarily that that my approach is all that different, except that mine is a work of synthesis based on secondary literature. Whereas, of course, Alistair has, spent years in Brussels and The Hague in archives, mining those archives very, very effectively. And I feel like I'm the happy beneficiary of that. So.
Mm-hmm. The questions keep coming thick and fast. So Janice Gibbs, do you get a sense of why the northern part of the Low Countries developed their regime of toleration? I think you said something about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that. There's the pecuniary motive of, if you allow a regime of toleration, you don't have to, you let people do their own thing, and you attract people from all over the world, and you attract a cosmopolitan populace that will help your economy, right? So on one level, it's a very base material incentive, but I think also it's the harshness of that judicial apparatus that the Habsburgs first imposed already starting in the 1520s, that led the leaders of the Dutch Republic to, these are oligarchs, to conclude that it doesn't work, that imposing conformity doesn't work very well. And so it's, I don't want, they talk about freedom of conscience. And so in some ways it's a principled ideology, but in many other respects, it's just this very ad hoc, we'll make it up as we go along religious settlement. Right. And it's a religious, it's messy. It's not, there's lots of incidents of judicial suppression still of Catholics, Lutherans in the 1590s in the Dutch Republic. So I hesitate to make it more ideological than it is. I think it was more practical, and perhaps the fruit of political experience.
Yeah.
But there's no one document that would tell me that. I wish there were, but there isn't. So.
A question from Preston Hill. Have you encountered any doctrinal debates to do with soul sleep playing a role in the Reformation in the Low Countries, perhaps in Anabaptist strands?
Yeah, I think if you look at maybe the family of love, there are, these sort of spiritualist groups in the margins within the radical stream of the Reformation in the Low Countries, who David Joris, who is this mystic and from Delft, who eventually winds up in Basel, and he has a following for a while. There might be discussion of that there. But it's certainly, you're not going to find much of it among the mainstream, among the Catholic or Reformed strains of religious dissent. So no, I think maybe in the deeper depths of spiritualist theology here and there you might find it, but not on any sort of level that was very prevalent. So.
Another question sort of on the more theological side from Jan Klok. If I have understood correctly, the sola scriptura principle, which is primarily a hermeneutical principle, is also applied to the Anabaptist movement, and especially in the way in which they want to shape Christian life in social practice and politics. My question is this striving of the Anabaptists not, oops, sorry, lost it. It disappeared on me again.
Let me see, yeah.
Not more to be considered and interpreted from a different perspective than the sola scriptura principle, namely the theocratic ideal? Scripture does, of course, play a role in this, but not in a hermeneutical sense.
Sure, yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. I think at least among the Melchiorite Anabaptists of the 1530s, the most apocalyptic bunch, there was certainly a belief that the kingdom of God was at hand, and we should do all we can to usher it in. That is certainly true. I think in the 1530s, Melchior Hoffmann is styling himself a prophet, and he thinks the world is going to end in 1533 and that sort of thing. So, yeah, and Münster is a very messy attempt at recreating or creating that theocratic ideal. It doesn't work very well. However, I think also the sola scriptura has a role to play. In other words, there's all these movements that later become known, get lumped together under this label Protestant. They all have a biblicism in common. Right now, the degree of biblicism, that is, how far do we go in applying biblical norms to, or what we understand biblical norms to be, to everyday life or to the life of the church, I think that varies among groups. But I would not dismiss. I mean, to me, there is an element, certainly, especially after Münster, when you get to Mennonitism and the Doopsgezinde, that yeah, this is what does the Bible tell us about how to be a good Christian? Right. And it may not be theocratic. It may be more, interior piety and how we reform ourselves rather than we reform society. But I think the biblicism plays a role in that. So.
Okay. From Elise Watson, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. How do you see those who lived in various parts of the Low Countries identifying themselves over the course of these changes? Was there any sense of pan-Low Countries identity outside of identification with city or province? And if so, did this change throughout the 16th and 17th century?
Oh, that's a good question. And lots has been written about this too, whether there's any sense of national identity. I think in the 16th century, people identify themselves locally. Among a few intellectuals here and there might be a sense of a Belgia or Belgica or the larger Low Countries. And in the 17th century, there are people on both sides of the border, the military frontier, who would like to see the whole of the Low Countries, the Habsburg Low Countries, reconquered, either for Protestantism or Catholicism. But I find that evocations of a larger Netherland identity is primarily confined to propaganda, to print, and not so much among ordinary peoples. There are references to patria and that sort of thing. But no, I mean, and when I talk in this book, I talk about the Habsburg Low Countries, and I don't want to overstate the case. I mean, it's a composite monarchy. It's still scattered and atomized and decentralized, even when the Habsburgs, assemble a fair amount of territory. I mean, even in after 1585, when you have the Catholic Netherlands, it's still a fairly atomized polity. So I don't see much of it beyond in the realm of sort of discussions among intellectuals and humanists.
Yep, good. Okay, last two questions. One from Sabine. I have a question about the methodology. If you're summarizing existing research without going back to sources, how do you make your analysis?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think I started out by reading a lot of this stuff and then basically concentrating on what struck out to me over and over again in the literature. This was an attempt to synthesize a lot of other people's work. And so I read through a lot of it, and only slowly did I figure out that some of the same themes were coming up again, whether it was urbanization, whether it was the political evolution of the Low Countries in the 16th century. It's a lot of it is picking and choosing. Right. And I will be frank about that. I think to me, it's the political environment of the Low Countries that is the most definitive in terms of how influencing how Reformation occurred. But an equally valid case could be made perhaps for social or economic circumstances as well. Right? But also, I wanted to write this book, like I said, for non-specialists and for people who may have a kind of nominal acquaintance with major developments. But also, my goal was to talk about this in the light of all the great work that's been done by Reformation historians more generally. Things like early modern Catholicism and how does confessionalization fit into this model and that sort of thing. So my analysis is kind of informed by how I understand the whole literature, right? And people will either like it or not and disagree with it or not, but this was an attempt, and this is kind of what I found to be most congenial.
And the last question. How do you see the role of the stadtholders in the Reformation in the North? Many European Reformations are princes' Reformations. For the Netherlands, the focus seems to lie on urban magistracies, but what about the House of Orange and the high nobility more generally?
Yeah, there's no princely Reformation in the Low Countries, although one could make the argument that Catholic reform in the 16th century, which was very much directed by the Habsburg Dynasty, or directed, it was encouraged and to a certain extent conducted by the Habsburg Dynasty. One could make a case for princely Reformation there. Now the House of Orange, well, the House of Orange in the 17th century, of course, becomes associated with the Reformed Church, partly because Maurice of Nassau takes sides in the controversy over the Arminians. But that's kind of a later cultural phenomenon. It's not really happening necessarily yet in the period I talk about. Certainly by the 16 teens and 20s, the Reformed Church has kind of rehabilitated William of Orange into a Calvinist prince, which he was not quite. But on the role, and the stadtholders don't have that much power in the Dutch Republic. I mean, they have influence and they have authority, and they run the army, at least through the 1620s. But I would not say there's a princely Reformation.
Okay. Wow. Well, we have covered a lot of ground here. Christine, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I think we've really enjoyed the opportunity to hear from you and to really see the themes of this book come out. Congratulations on this project. And we look forward to seeing it in print. Hopefully, what you think, maybe later in
next year, I hope.
Next year. We'll go for next year. That would be really good.
Let's say that. So.
All right. And for everyone who's interested, we should have another presentation from Visiting Scholar. This would be on August 5. So keep watching your inboxes for news about the next one. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful evening.
Appreciate it.
Bye now.